Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome everyone. My name is Alize Henry from the Small Arms Survey, and I'm happy to moderate today's briefing that is chaired by the Permanent Mission of the Federal Republic of Nigeria to the United Nations and other international organizations. This is the second of a briefings series on counter-IED that will be dedicated to approaches and challenges related to regional perspectives to counter-IED. Before we begin, I would like to draw your attention on a few basic housekeeping points. So please note that the session is being recorded. While your microphones will be muted during the speaker's interventions, you will have the possibility to turn it on during the Q&A session at the end. You will be invited to ask questions either by raising your hand or in the chat, and we will try to accommodate as many interventions as possible, depending on how much time we have. I will now give the floor to Mark Downs, the director of the Small Arms Survey, for the opening remarks. Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alize, and very welcome to distinguished delegates and dear colleagues. Let me begin by welcoming you to the second session of the briefing series on countering improvised explosive devices. As highlighted in our previous discussion, IEDs continue to pose one of the most complex and evolving security challenges facing states and communities today. Their use cuts across multiple contexts, from armed conflict and terrorism to organized crime, and their impacts extend far beyond the immediate blast site. They continue to affect civilian safety, humanitarian operations, economic activity, and most importantly, public trust in state institutions. The objective of this briefing series is to create a bit of a space where policymakers and practitioners and researchers can collectively come together to reflect on how our responses to the IED threat should evolve. And the aim is to bring together operational experience, analytical insights, and policy discussions. And so we hope to be able to contribute to a more coherent and forward-looking international response to this continuing threat. Today's session focuses on a particularly important dimension of this challenge, and that's the role of regional approaches in addressing the threat posed by IEDs. While the drivers of IED use may vary from one context to another, many of the enabling factors transcend national borders and boundaries. Supply chains for precursor materials often extend across neighboring countries, and armed groups operate across porous frontiers. Knowledge and tactics circulate rapidly across regions, and in such environments, regional approaches can help address this challenge in several ways. They can foster greater policy coherence across neighboring states. They can facilitate information sharing and joint analysis, and they can support the pulling together of expertise, capabilities, and resources. They can also provide an important bridge between global normative frameworks and the specific operational realities faced by states on the ground. Over the past several years, the Small Arms Survey has sought to contribute to these regional efforts by supporting the regionalization of policy discussions related to counter-IED efforts. In West Africa, for example, we've worked closely with the ECOWAS Commission and its member states and international partners such as UNIDIR and MAG to support the development of a regional response to address the threats posed by IEDs. And in parallel, the survey has supported national IED capability assessments in both ECOWAS and REXA member states. Through these assessments, we've aimed to help governments evaluate their existing institutional capacities to prevent, detect, respond to, and investigate IED threats. An important component of this work has also involved strengthening the evidence base on IED threats. And last year, the survey tested its analytical framework in East Africa, which helps states better understand over time the drivers and the enabling factors and the patterns of IED use. Through these multiple engagements, several regional trends and commonalities have emerged. These findings reinforce a key lesson, and that is that while responses must ultimately be implemented at a national level, many aspects of the threat, as well as opportunities for effective prevention, are inherently regional in nature. And this is precisely why conversations such as the one we are having here today are so important. They allow us to reflect collectively on how regional organizations, national authorities, and international partners and research organizations can work together to build a more coherent, collaborative, and sustainable response to the evolving IED threat. Before handing over back to Elise, allow me to express our sincere appreciation to the Government of Ireland for its support to this initiative and to the permanent mission of the Federal Republic of Nigeria to the United Nations and other international organizations here in Geneva for chairing the session. I really look forward to a rich and constructive discussion, and thank you very much, Gurmil Mahagat, and back to Elise.
Thank you very much, Mark, for setting the scene. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Frederick Udobia, Minister Consular in charge of disarmament affairs at the Permanent Mission of the Federal Republic of Nigeria to the UN and other international organizations in Geneva. Mr. Udobia will walk us through the way IEDs affect West Africa and underscore the value added of a regional and continental responses thereto. Mr. Udobia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alizi. And I want to first of all register my appreciation for giving me this opportunity to chair this online briefing. It's indeed an honor. I'd like to also appreciate the government of Ireland and Small Arms Survey and everyone that has joined this online briefing. So, we'll talk about IEDs as a transnational threat with focus on West Africa and the implications for Nigeria. So improvised explosive devices, as we've heard from Mr. Mark, are not confined to borders alone. They are, by the very nature, transnational threats, as it may seem. They tend to emerge within broader regional security ecosystems shaped by shared borders, interconnected conflicts, and transnational armed networks. Instability in one country can quickly reverberate across neighboring states. Often, materials used to fabricate them are moved across jurisdictions, and the knowledge required to assemble them circulates online. And networks that deploy them frequently operate across porous frontiers. In West Africa, we see that IED networks do not rely on isolated local sourcing. They draw on transnational supply chains, diverting commercially manufactured explosives and dual-use chemicals from legitimate market into illicit ones. They also incorporate trafficked military-grade ordnance and recycled explosive remnants of war. These flows are sustained by cross-border smuggling routes, regulatory gaps, and weak oversights. At the same time, bomb-making expertise moves across theaters, and armed groups learn from and reinforce one another, further entrenching the transnational nature of the threat. Within the ECOWAS space, Nigeria has borne a particularly heavy share of human costs associated with IED uses. In 2024 alone, record shows that Nigeria experienced 197 IED attacks. According to United Nations Office of Drug and Crime, this amounts, on average, to almost one attack every 2 days. This figure underscores both the scale and the persistence of the challenge. In West Africa, IEDs have been used not only as tactical weapons, but as strategic tools to control territory, restrict mobility, disrupt market and agriculture, and undermine trust between communities and states. For Nigeria, this has meant direct security challenges, but also broader developmental and humanitarian implications. IED contamination affects freedom of movement, humanitarian access, cross-border trade, and regional integration. In its strategic plan for 2025 to 2030, the Nigerian National Counterterrorism Center recognizes the growing IED threats, and identifies the development of a dedicated national C-IED strategy as a priority. The objective is to ensure a more unified, coordinated, and whole of government response to the increasing use of IEDs by terrorist groups. The strategic plan has also provides for establishment of the counter-IED working group and the further utilization of the National Counterterrorism Center National Counterterrorism Center Forensic Laboratory as the National Counter-IED Hub. This will strengthen technical analysis of devices, enhance intelligence and construction methods and capabilities, and support efforts to identify and disrupt bomb-making networks. But given the inherently transnational nature of the IED threat, no country can address it in isolation. The reality naturally leads us to the importance of collective actions. For this reason, Nigeria works closely with regional institutions and neighboring states to confront these challenges in a coordinated and cooperative manner. So the next thing we'll discuss the need for collective responses, continental and regional. In West Africa, ECOWAS community has seen the importance of strengthening cooperation through regional framework and institutions. Information sharing, joint operations, harmonization of legal frameworks, and coordinated border management are not optional. They are essential. At the continental level, African Union has also recognized the need for integrated approaches to countering terrorism and violent extremism, within which IED threats must be addressed. That said, regional approaches must remain context-specific. The pattern of IED use in West Africa differs from those in other regions. The actors' terrain, governance challenges, and community dynamics are very and considerable. Therefore, effective regional cooperation requires political trust, sustained commitment, investment in national capacities that feed into regional mechanisms, and flexibility to adapt frameworks to evolving threat patterns. Lessons for our region is not that there is a single model to replicate, but that collective action grounded in local reality significantly enhances impact. So number 3, we'll discuss the importance of integrating regional perspective into global policy discussions. So as we look ahead at the forthcoming global discussion around addressing the threat posed by IED, it is essential that these conversations are informed by regional experiences and that they also take into account operational realities, including capacity constraint, cross-border dynamics, and community-level impact, which also shape what is feasible and sustainable. A more systematic integration of regional perspective can, number 1, improve policy relevance, avoid one-size-fits-all approaches, and strengthen ownerships at the national and regional levels. Ultimately, coherence between national, regional, and global effort is what determines whether our collective response to IED threats is effective and sustainable. Finally, yet importantly, international cooperation can only be strengthened if regions continue to share their experiences openly, learn from one another's approach, and build partnerships across geographical boundaries. By exchanging lessons, both successes and challenges, we can foster more informed, coherent, and mutually reinforcing responses to the evolving IED threats. So next, we'll talk about setting the tone for today's briefing. The transnational nature of IED threats calls for solidarity, coordination, and mutual learning. Today's discussion is therefore timely Regional approaches provide an essential bridge between national implementation and global policy. Our task today is therefore not only to get insight from regional experiences, but to ensure that the meaningfully informed and multilateral frameworks that guides our collective efforts. So that's the end of my opening remarks. I hope it made sense to everyone. I'll hand over to Alizi again, and I'll wait for further interaction. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Udobia. We will now move to the thematic briefing, and in this regard, I'm pleased to introduce Paul Amoroso, who is counter-IED and weapons and ammunition management specialist at the Small Arms Survey, and will provide an analysis of regional perspectives to counter-IED with a focus on sub-regional initiatives in Africa. Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you, Elise. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to session 2 of our strategic reflection series on counter-IED efforts. Today, we turn to regional perspectives, why they matter, what they reveal, and how they can strengthen global policy. Today's session is possible by the support of the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, facilitated by the Small Arms Survey, and chaired by Mr. Frederick Udobia of the Permanent Mission of the Federal Republic of Nigeria to the UN and other international organisations. Today, we once again bring together diplomats, policymakers, practitioners and experts from across the international community to stimulate reflection and dialogue on emerging trends and drivers of IED use. Across the 3 guiding documents of the UN Secretary-General's 2024 report, the UN General Assembly Resolution 77 of 64, and CCW RevCon 6 final report, we see a consistent message. IEDs are a global threat with deeply regional characteristics. They cross borders, exploit regional supply chains, and adapt to local political economies. And they therefore require responses which must be not only national, but regional in design. In particular, the UN General Assembly Resolution 77 of 64 stresses the need for international and regional cooperation to address the theft, trafficking, diversion, and illicit use of materials for making IEDs. While RevCon 6 report highlighted the need to address the threat posed by IEDs in relevant fora at appropriate levels and by multiple stakeholders. In session 1, we outlined how 2026 is a pivotal year for international counter-IED efforts. The UN Secretary-General's report on IEDs is due for release by the end of quarter 2. The 2024 report provided us with a comprehensive overview of global trends, humanitarian impacts, and evolving responses to IEDs, highlighting the urgent need for coordinated, regionally nuanced strategies. Its analysis and recommendations directly inform policy reflection and dialogues for the pending Secretary-General's report, as well as the General Assembly resolution and the CCW Review Conference, also happening this year. The 7th CCW RevCon is scheduled for November of this year, with the final report of the 6th Review Conference emphasising humanitarian impact, technical developments, and the need for unity of action. Finally, the UN General Assembly resolution on IEDs is due to be released in December. The 2024 resolution, 77 of 64, calls for open, informal consultations and ongoing dialogue among states, international and regional organisations, NGOs, and to include the private sector, so as to harmonise efforts, raise awareness, and coordinate prevention and response strategies. Both the 2024 General Assembly resolution and the 6th RevCon final report provide a comprehensive policy framework and set of recommendations that align directly with the intent of these 4 discussions, intended to stimulate reflection, facilitate dialogue, and inform future policy on IEDs. Session 3 and 4 of this series will be delivered in June of this year. In session 1, we also introduced the concept of the IED ecosystem, a framework that distinguishes, firstly, the IED system, consisting of the network of personnel, processes, and supply of material that are needed for IED use. Secondly, the persistent elements of IED use consisting of the drivers of why actors choose IEDs, the enabling conditions that create the permissive environments that allow for their use, the enablers in terms of the active processes that sustain IED systems, as well as the inherent asymmetric characteristics of IEDs. Finally, we discussed the third element of IED ecosystems, the Access D model, which outlines 7 catalysts accelerating IED proliferation. These include access to IED components and technology, conflict-driven permissive environments, convergence of improvised weapon systems, electronic and digital financial systems, supply chains and regulatory enablers, state to non-state capability proliferation, and digital knowledge networks. The UN Secretary General's 2024 report reinforces this ecosystem view, noting the widening implications of IED use, the global network of information exchange, and the increasing sophistication of devices and tactics. Today, we will apply the ecosystem lens to regional dynamics, with a particular focus on Africa, with the topics as shown on screen to be covered. These include regionalized IED ecosystems, in which we examine the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, as well as Africa. We will take a focus on Africa, examining the conditions, catalysts, and capability sharing across the continent, which is best viewed as a multi-regional IED ecosystem. Continuing with our focus on Africa, we will take a deeper look at the continent-wide IED threat, the multiple transnational armed groups facilitating IED activity across porous borders, and the regional spread of drone-delivered IEDs. We will then examine what regional approaches to counter-IED have been invested in within Africa. We will conclude by drawing on regional experiences to provide some recommendations for the next UN Secretary General's report, the upcoming CCW RevCon, and the UN General Assembly resolution. We will commence by examining what is meant by a regionalized IED ecosystem. A regionalized IED ecosystem emerges when the manufacture, movement, and use of IEDs transcend national borders and become embedded within cross-border political, economic, and security dynamics. Such ecosystems are characterized by transnational armed groups operating across porous borders, shared supply chains for precursor chemicals, commercial explosives, and dual-use technologies, cross-regional diffusion of tactics, techniques, and procedures, and enabling conditions such as ungoverned spaces, weak regulatory control environments, and regional trafficking networks that span multiple states simultaneously. Globally, 3 regions of note exhibit these characteristics most clearly: the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, as well as Africa. Together, these regions illustrate why countering the IED threat increasingly requires regional, not solely national approaches, as recognized across the UN Secretary General's report, the UN General Assembly resolution, and the CCW RevCon final report. The Middle East has long-standing conflicts, state to non-state capability transfers, and sophisticated knowledge networks that have been highly adaptive in their IED systems that have emerged. It has highly sophisticated IED actors such as Daesh and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and Hezbollah, to name but a few. It also has a history of cross-border flow of IED facilitation, for example, between Iraq and Syria, as well as from Yemen into the Horn of Africa. State to non-state proliferation is an issue, along with drone IED innovation. However, the region's IED threat is more centralized, exemplified by Daesh's core, less geographically dispersed, more influenced by state actors, and less reliant on porous borders compared to the effects in Africa. Overall, it is a regional threat, but not as multi-regional or multi-actor as is the case in Africa. South Asia, consisting of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, along with Southeast Asia, encompassing Philippines, Myanmar, and Thailand, where entrenched insurgencies, criminal economies, and cross-border militant, insurgent, and extremist networks sustain persistent IED use. However, the threat tends to be localized within national insurgencies, less interconnected across subregions, and less dependent on transnational supply chains. There is regionalization, but not to the same continent-wide multi-regional IED ecosystem as seen in Africa. While cross-border IED actor mobility exists in the Middle East, as well as South and Southeast Asia, it is generally less pronounced compared to Africa due to more controlled or militarized borders. Africa has seen the convergence of porous borders, diverse armed actors, expanding drone IED capabilities, and continent-wide trafficking routes to produce one of the most interconnected and rapidly evolving regional IED ecosystems. Africa today provides the clearest illustration of a regionalized IED threat ecosystem anywhere in the world. While the Middle East, as well as South and Southeast Asia, also face entrenched and highly lethal IED challenges, Africa stands out because its problem is systematic, cross-border, and multi-regional in ways that are distinct. This is not simply a matter of scale or frequency. It is the systematic, interconnected nature of the IED activity that makes Africa the most complete contemporary example of multi-regional IED ecosystem. This unique multi-regional IED ecosystem can be understood through three interlocking dynamics of the conditions creating demand and opportunity for IED use. Secondly, the catalyst reducing barriers to IED use globally. And thirdly, the capability sharing ongoing across the continent. This does not diminish the severity of IED use in other regions. Rather, it highlights Africa as the most fully developed and cross-border, multi-regional, mutually reinforced IED ecosystem. Some of the structural conditions within Africa that create both the demand and the opportunity for IED use include ungoverned or weakly governed spaces due to large rural areas with weak state presence and limited security force reach, which provides safe operating environments for IED activity. Sustained and protracted conflicts related to long-running insurgencies, civil wars, and post-collapse security vacuums create permissive conditions where armed groups can operate, experiment, and sustain IED use with limited disruption. Accessible borders, which are porous and weakly controlled, enabling cross-border movement of components, expertise, fighters, and knowledge, facilitating the diffusion of IED capabilities across subregions and allowing groups to exploit sanctuary and supply routes. Grievance-driven fragility, often due to political and socio-economic conditions, typically based on widespread marginalization, unemployment, and local grievances that increase community vulnerability to recruitment, coercion, and influence by IED actors, strengthening their support base and operational freedom. And finally, the effectiveness of IEDs in cost to non-state actors. As IEDs deliver high strategic impact at minimal financial and logistical costs, they enable groups to offset their disadvantage against state forces and sustain operations without relying on external arms suppliers. This makes IEDs the most economically rational weapon available to African non-state actors. Sustained and protracted conflicts have been discussed as one of the conditions creating demand and opportunities for IED use in Africa. This directly contributes to conflict-driven permissive environments, which is one of the 7 catalysts we identified in session 1 that lower barriers to IED access and adaptation. These 7 catalysts are captured by the mnemonic Access D, as shown on screen. 2 of these, digital knowledge networks and electronic and digital financial systems, are global catalysts that significantly lower barriers for IED actors everywhere. African IED systems actively exploit both. For example, Al-Shabaab is widely recognized for its sophisticated use of electronic and digital financial systems, supports its operations, including the financing of its IED activities. Africa's IED landscape is most significantly shaped by conflict-driven permissive environment, cross-border knowledge diffusion, and digital knowledge networks, which collectively lower barriers to their use within Africa. The United Nations Secretary General's 2024 report states that the number of groups with the capacity to use IEDs and sophistication of these devices is expected to increase as a result of international knowledge transfer. Capabilities move across borders both actively through deliberate transfer, training, and organizational linkages, as well as passive transfer through diffusion, imitation, and environmental conditions that support IED capability development. The IED capability sharing being witnessed within Africa is due to several factors, which include the IED threat spanning across Africa, multiple transnational armed groups active across porous borders, and the regional spread of drone-delivered IEDs. The 2024 UN Secretary General's report identified that between 2020 and 2023, 65 countries were affected globally by IEDs, but Africa alone accounts for a disproportionate share, with IEDs affecting Cameroon, Central African Republic, Mozambique, Sudan, South Sudan, Libya, Chad, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya. In particular, Somalia, Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo remain among the most affected countries in the world. No other region has this breadth of simultaneous IED-affected states. Multiple IED actors operate across porous borders and ungoverned spaces within Africa, creating a uniquely dense ecosystem of regions spanning IED systems, facilitating IED use through the sharing of IED components, knowledge, and TTPs. The Secretary General's 2024 report notes that non-state actors exploit porous borders, facilitating cross-border movements, shelter, and preparation of attacks. This dynamic is especially visible in Africa. For example, it's known that JNIM, ISGS, and ISWAP move fighters, components, and expertise between Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria. The Sahel, Lake Chad Basin, East Africa, and North Africa, including Libya and the Sinai Peninsula, form interconnected zones where fighters, precursors, IED expertise, drone components, and diverted commercial explosives have in the past and continually currently move fluidly between such regions. The 2024 UN Secretary General's report also noted the same type of remote control units are being used in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, suggesting the technical information is being shared transnationally, which is a hallmark of regionalized IED ecosystems. It is the systematic interconnected nature of African IED activity, supported by porous borders and ungoverned spaces, that make Africa the most complete contemporary example of a multi-regional IED ecosystem. On this slide over the next few minutes, you will see several areas on the map marked with a red tab. These are intended only as a general geographic indicator of where different transnational armed groups have operated over time. They should not be interpreted as a precise depiction of territorial control, fixed front lines, or specific attack locations. It is important to emphasize that the situation on the ground is more fluid than any static map can ever convey. Groups may shift routes, disperse, fragment, or re-emerge in different locations, depending on pressure, opportunity, and local conditions. For that reason, the map should be understood as a contextual guide, not a representation of current control, capability, or intent. Our aim here is to simply provide a continental-wide orientation, helping to situate the discussion of transnational threats within Africa's broader geography. The map is therefore illustrative rather than definitive, supporting the narrative rather than defining it. Some of the main transnational IED groups in Africa include JNIM, operating across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, with fighters, components, and TTPs moving fluidly across borders. The Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, or ISGS, which later formally integrated into the broader Islamic State Sahel Province, ISSP, emerging around 2015, operate primarily across the tri-border Liptako-Gourma region of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. They exploit porous borders, ungoverned spaces, long-running conflict dynamics, and cross-border supply routes to sustain mobility, recruitment, and IED activity across the Sahel. Islamic State West Africa Province, or ISWAP, operate across the Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Cameroon borders within the Lake Chad Basin, exploiting porous borders and ungoverned spaces to move materiel, personnel, and IED expertise. Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF, operate across the DRC-Uganda border, drawing on regional trafficking networks, legacy ammunition stocks to support IED use. ASWJ, or Alu Sunna wal Jamaa, operate between Mozambique and Tanzania for cross-border sanctuary recruitment and movement of IED components. Al-Shabaab operate between Somalia and Kenya, sourcing precursors and IED components through regional commercial networks, including maritime routes to Yemen. Sinai-based groups such as ISIS Sinai Province have had IED activity linked to weapons and components trafficked from Libya, demonstrating transnational chain between Libya, Egypt's western desert, and into Sinai. Finally, Libyan armed groups and militias are linked to IED use connected to the post-2011 arms flows that spread across North Africa and into the Sahel. This enabled non-state actors in neighbouring states to access explosives, munitions, and technical expertise. An illustrative example of capability sharing within Africa is the regional spread of drone-delivered IEDs. Shown on the left is a map from the Africa Centre for Strategic Studies from April 2015. This indicates which states, shown in grey, have acquired drones, while those that produce them domestically are indicated by the yellow icon. For our purposes, the orange icon is of most interest, indicating confirmed armed non-state actor drone use, which includes drone-deployed IEDs. In the top centre is an indication of the increase in conventional and improvised drone strikes, along with associated casualties across Africa from 2011 to 2024. Two illustrative examples of improvised drone use is shown from North Kivu in the DRC, as well as from Central African Republic. Finally, the significant use of weaponized, uncrewed aerial vehicles to attack UN peacekeepers in the vicinity of Kimoka, Eastern DRC on the 12th of February 2024 is shown on the lower right. This is said to involve 8 quadcopter-type uncrewed aerial vehicles, with 6 exploding on impact, 1 reportedly shot down but not recovered, and 1 failing to explode on impact. While the use of weaponized commercially available uncrewed aerial vehicles by non-state armed groups have been widely reported in the region, none had been against the UN specifically up to this point. The UN Secretary-General's 2024 report notes increasing use of small uncrewed aerial vehicles by non-state armed groups. The growing indications that African groups are developing offensive strike capabilities include the adaptation of weaponized, uncrewed aerial systems by groups such as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, with spillover effects into Africa. Africa is seeing the cross-pollination of design knowledge and capabilities from conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine. The exploitation of commercial drone supply chains through regional markets. Hybrid drone IED convergence systems are emerging in the Sahel, and the use of FPV, or first-person view drones, for kamikaze attacks in Somalia have been witnessed. This is happening across multiple African regions simultaneously and is not confined to one conflict only. The emergence and proliferation of drone-delivered IED reinforce the need for regional IED component controls with a focus on monitoring of drone imports, shared forensic and technical intelligence, and common standards for counter-UAS and counter-IED integration. Such requirements provide us with a segue into why regional approaches into countering IED threats are essential. We know that IED systems operate regionally. Their material supply chains cross borders, IED knowledge transfer is transnational, and the drivers and enabling conditions for IED use are shared across neighbouring states. While national counter-IED strategies are essential, owing to the transnational threat posed by IED use, and in particular the prevalence of regionalised IED ecosystems, such national strategies are insufficient on their own, with regional approaches being required. For example, the UN General Assembly Resolution 7764 stresses the need for regional cooperation, information sharing, and cross-border control of precursors. Regional approaches must be context-specific because the drivers of IED use differ between various regions across the continent. The enabling conditions such as governance, terrain, and political economy vary widely. The actors differ from insurgents and extremists to militias and also include criminal networks. The technical complexity and tactical sophistication of the IED threat being countered differs from pressure plate devices in Mozambique to radio-controlled IEDs in the Sahel, person-borne IEDs in Somalia. UN General Assembly Resolution 77 of 64 recognises this by encouraging whole-of-government approaches and regional cooperation tailored to local contexts. Within the African regional organisations, there are several counter-ID frameworks which are being developed or worked upon, 3 of which are note. The IED from IGAD strategy is notable for having a civilian police military model, 7 lines of effort including information exchange, precursor control, and civil military cooperation, an emphasis on cross-border cooperation, as well as integration of inclusive security considerations to include mental health support. It aligns strongly with UN General Assembly Resolution 77 of 64, calling for information sharing, capacity building, victim assistance, and private sector engagement. The IED threat in West Africa involves IED use by ISSP, JNIM, and ISWAP, shared remote control technologies migrating between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, as well as regional smuggling routes for precursors and commercial explosives. ECOWAS has IED control, precursor control initiatives in place, as well as a regional counter-ID strategy under development. There are also joint border operations supported by Interpol and the World Customs Organization. These ECOWAS initiatives reflect the UN Secretary General's emphasis on regional and multinational communities of action. An emerging AU continental counter-ID strategy, combined with a humanitarian mine action strategy, is currently under development. This AU strategy provides a continental framework for prevention, response, and cooperation, a focus on resource mobilization, government support, and cross-border collaboration, as well as providing a platform for harmonizing national and regional approaches. This is the closest Africa has to a continent-wide strategic approach to counter-ID, aligning directly with the CCW RevCon 6's call for coordinated multi-stakeholder action. No other region has this many regional counter-ID architectures under development at once. This makes Africa the clearest policy example of a regionalized approach to an IED threat. Drawing on regional experience, the next UN Secretary General's report, the upcoming CCW RevCon 7, and the UN General Assembly resolution could introduce the concept of IED ecosystem in order to improve analytic coherence across UN reporting and member state responses. It could recognize regional catalysts lowering the barriers to IED access by including cross-border precursor flows, digital knowledge networks, and drone IED convergence. It could encourage regional specific counter-ID strategies by explicitly referencing the IGAD strategy, ECOWAS regional initiatives, and the AU strategy under development. It can move to strengthen language on cross-border cooperation by including joint forensic analysis, access to state counter-ID enterprises to regional and international counter-ID management systems, and regional precursor control mechanisms. It can encourage integration of counter-UAS measures into counter-ID frameworks to reflect the rise of drone-delivered IEDs. It can highlight coercive and semi-coercive recruitment, as noted in the UN Secretary General's report, particularly the use of children in IED activities. Finally, it can promote regional victim assistance frameworks through alignment with the UN policy on victim assistance, as well as regional humanitarian systems. To conclude, IEDs are no longer simply improvised devices acting as inhibitors to national security, humanitarian initiatives, and development programs. They're improvised systems embedded in regional ecosystems, accelerated by global catalysts and sustained by local enabling conditions. IEDs in Africa could be said to be manufactured locally, enabled regionally, and catalyzed through global catalysts. Africa illustrates how regional IED ecosystems have created a continental problem requiring regional responses, which ideally should be coordinated to complement each other on a continental basis. Despite Africa's multi-regional IED ecosystem, coordinated regional counter-IED response and even a continent-wide approach is being pursued. For this reason, Africa presents lessons that can be learned elsewhere globally in terms of threat evolution, as well as in terms of effective regional responses. As we move towards the 2026 UN Secretary General's report, the next UN General Assembly resolution, and CCW RevCon 7, we have an opportunity. This opportunity is that we may modernize our conceptual framing, strengthen regional cooperation, integrate emerging technologies, and ensure that our collective response matches the scale and sophistication of the threat. This is the second in a series of 4 sessions. Further sessions will address humanitarian development implications and people-centered responses. We encourage you to stay engaged and contribute to these important discussions. Thank you to my colleagues from the Small Arms Survey for organising this session, the permanent mission of the Federal Republic of Nigeria to the UN and other international organisations for chairing today's session, and the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs for funding this initiative. Your engagement is invaluable. To all participants and attendees, we look forward to continuing this dialogue and working together towards effective and sustainable international counter-IED efforts. Thank you for your attendance, attention and engagement with this important international security, development and humanitarian issue. I will now hand back to Elise, who will invite questions and open the floor for discussion. And my email is on screen should you wish to contact me on any of the matters we raised today. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing these discussions.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this very clear and comprehensive briefing. So yeah, we will now open the floor for questions. So please raise your hand or write in the chat, and keep your questions as concise as possible and direct them to a specific speaker if you can. Don't be shy. So maybe in the meantime, I can read what Richard Carina has written in the chat. He would like more information on the civilian police military strategy model.
Do you want me to go? Yeah, will I go ahead and direct that? Okay. So we're referring to the EGAD strategy there. And ultimately they broadly gave guidance on what is called the criminal justice model approach to a national counter-IED strategy or regional strategy, or what they have termed the war model approach. And the 2 terms effectively talk about you are approaching it under national criminal justice laws, and that is the pursuit of those involved in the IED system through legal framework. And then the other effort would be more military based and traditional, from where the concept of the modern manifestation of counter-IED came from, which is military centric. And you're looking at rules of law, international humanitarian law would be the rules in which they operate under there. So just to recap, it's kind of the criminal justice model approach and would be the police model. And then we have the military model, which would be what they call the war model approach.
Thank you, Paul. We have another question in the chat from Richard A. Loben, who teaches CT, so maybe counterterrorism at the Naval War College, and he's asking about the declining role of AFRICOM, whether you can say anything about it.
I don't have an informed opinion on AFRICOM's decline. And what I do know is I have, in my time working in Africa, worked very closely with them. They have been very fruitful partners and have supported a lot of African nations through their militaries and going into civ-mil cooperation as well. But in the terms of the current decline, I wouldn't have an informed opinion there, but they are valued partners in the efforts within Africa.
I have another question in the chat. How could Somalia be proactive and prevent drone IED?
Was that Somalia in particular question?
That's a question that directly relates to Somalia.
Okay. Well, whatever approach Somalia takes, it can be transformed to any of the countries where we do have the drone IED nexus, either established or emerging. And it's no different than the approach which you take to IEDs as a whole. It's not one solution. We very much have to banish the idea that there's a silver bullet solution to the drone IED nexus. It's going to be a multiple of initiatives, both hard and kinetic at the point at which the attack is taking place, and trying to stop them by various technological means. And we're looking at the equivalent there of what we consider to be the defeat the device capabilities under traditional counter IED, and then there's a suite of other opportunities and technologies which are either mature and developed or are developing that can be applied at that hard end. And then we have to look at the bigger issues of trying to stop the drone IED nexus no more than we stop the IED problem, and that's the supply chains. Right back to the radicalization of why is the fertile ground there that the environment is conducive to the use of IEDs and the drones. So it's a whole suite, and it's not that it's impossible, it's just that it's not one thing, and we've to very much dispel the idea, no matter how much some companies may advocate that their solution will be the solution to the problem, and no more than the toolbox that when we go out and do defeat the device and its improvised explosive device disposal, you have a suite of tools, you have a toolbox of tools, and there's going to need to be a toolbox of tools developed iteratively to address the drone IED nexus going forward.
Thank you, Paul. I see that Oyewole Ojini raised her hand, so you have the floor. And we also have then Chukwutsitsara Mbamara.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for a very nice presentation. I'm Oyewole Ogini. I'm a senior researcher at Bor International Center for Conflict. So my area of focus is non-state armed group, the weapon and ammunition in their hand, basically in the Lake Chad Basin and in the Gulf of Guinea. So I find the presentation interesting. I have three questions. The first question has to do with the draft of the continental strategy on IED, how far it is, because I'm reflecting right now that if we don't have it very fast, then we can have sub-regional implementation of that, which I think is also urgently needed to get things done. I wanted to find out if you have any idea about that. The second point, you mentioned that many of these places are non-governance area, and since you highlighted the aspect of human-centered approach to counter IED, and I also feel that this area are not ungoverned because many of the area have individual, they have communities, they have traditional rulers who are staying there. What they don't have is the state presence. And because of that, so which means somehow there's an urgent need to have a rethink on how we think of this space and to see how we can leverage the existing actor there to be able to, for example, in terms of the drone, counter-drone, which state cannot do without this local, to see how they can provide soft knowledge to enable them to address the threats, especially not to go directly to touch these things, but at least they could have knowledge of how to deal with things in their own way. I think this is the second point. The third point concerns me, has to do with the Ukraine and the war across the Middle East. As these different drones are also being developed rapidly, I wanted to find out maybe from your work if there have been any preemptive strategy that have been put in place, because it's already well known to everybody that it's coming to Africa. It's going to come to the north of Africa, to the Sahel, to the desert, and it's going to get its way there. So this is the three questions. Thank you.
Lisa, would you want me to take those questions now, or someone else to speak?
How do you feel?
I think fantastic question. I think I will deal with these with the limited bandwidth I have. So thank you very much. Very engaging questions. In terms of the draft AU counter ID strategy, I previously have worked on that when it was a standalone counter ID strategy. And the AU are trying to consolidate and rationalize its number of strategies. So it's now taken the decision to integrate their Pan-African counter ID strategy along with their humanitarian mine action strategy under one document. As of October last year, they convened a meeting in which they progressed that. I am not in the know fully, but I believe they gave a kind of 9 to 12 month time frame where they were looking to try and progress that to fruition and getting sign off. I don't know if that sign off will be fully implemented or if it will be existing in draft form. But you mentioned under that the sub-regional point, and I would be a big believer. As much as we're advocating here, we need to have a continental approach and sub-regional approaches and then national approaches, and they all must be harmonized. It's much easier to say than to actually achieve. We shouldn't wait for perfect. They will probably be done in parallel. So if, for example, the Lake Chad Basin region or the Gulf of Guinea region or West Africa as a whole through ECOWAS want to progress a national or a regional strategic approach, they should do so, trying to coordinate such efforts with the AU where possible. But I've seen before where people wait for another element to be in place before they might develop their national strategy. There is no right time. We need to just get moving, and we need to have them as almost living documents. Just get the guidance. They are the vehicles by which we can get better coordination, collaboration, and cooperation. They shouldn't seem to be perfect. Good enough is good enough to get the better progress going. So I would say yes, absolutely. It's to be welcome the AU are doing this, but if there is to be regional strategies within Africa, they should also start in parallel, coordinate, cooperate, communicate as they're doing them. But it has to be parallel processes, and in time they will start complementing each other more and more the more communication and cooperation we have in these areas. Your second point about non-governed spaces, I completely accept. We might talk about non-governed spaces, but that statement comes from a central government perspective or the international community's perspective. In most of these spaces, there are local justice systems, local traditions. And what I would always advocate whenever we're doing this higher level thinking when it comes to counter ID, context is king. We can't go in and just template solutions which we've used elsewhere. And in the worst cases, I've seen that where we tried to bring what was implemented in Iraq or Afghanistan and tried to do it in theatres within Africa. And it simply doesn't work. We must build our solution set around the proper context understanding. So bringing it back to your point about what would be classified as non-governed spaces, that we are referring to non-governed spaces from the central government perspective. So then we have to ask what can work locally. We have to engage with the locals, be culturally sensitive and look at all the different dynamics that make up the political economy and very other factors we need to take into account when we're building that counter ID solution set. And do so where we're going to be open-minded to take on traditional conflict resolution methods and engagement methods and try and build something that's sustainable. Because artificially trying to transplant foreign, what we'll call solution sets into something that's alien to the local community isn't going to work, and we must engage and spend the time there, and that takes time and effort. Your final point about Ukraine and the Middle East, preemptive strategies. I may have got your question wrong, but are you talking about kind of the migration of the IED, the capabilities of drones coming into Africa? Yes, I would say if it's not already happening, and I've referenced in my brief there that there is known to be spillover of those capabilities from the likes of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula into Africa. And even if I talk about direct transfer, someone moving or actively trying to do it, problem we now have with the World Wide Web is that information domain is open. What the Ukraine conflict has especially shown us is that we literally have a full, almost university level knowledge set there online for anyone who wants to go about improvising drones and weaponizing them. There's very little that's now protected. What we used to have as security secret or sensitive, it's no longer there because there's such a flood of information online, and that's open globally. So it's available in Africa as well. So there will be certainly direct transfer, and then there's going to be indirect transfer just by that knowledge system. And it's not even the deep dark web. Some of them are open forums, and that's how easy it is to get that knowledge. And that's why it is considered one of the 7 catalysts that are fueling IED use globally. So if come back to me if you want any clarification of the points I provided there, and I'll hand back to Elise now.
Thank you, Paul. So we can now take the question of Chukwutsitara Mbamara.
Thank you very much for organizing this strategic briefing series. Mine is more of a contribution, which Paul, in answering the second question and the third question, tried to highlight some of my concerns. For me, I would like to say that countering IED is not just a framework, so to say, for African governments and for international organizations. We need more of advocacy. For some of us who are in the grassroots, we've had series of these IED explosions, and we begin to ask, how are these non-state actors able to overdo or outshine the government agencies? It's because we don't have the capabilities at the level of the government to counter these attacks when they come. So for me, I would recommend that the Small Arms Survey and its partners will do more in advocating for capacity building and enlightenment on behalf of the security agencies in Africa, so that at least they can upgrade their level of technicalities in countering these weapons. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, all relevant and very pertinent points there. The 2 points I take away from you is, we still need to greater empower the front end responses to counter IED and the security forces, and they need that support to build that, what we will call the defeat the device capability suite. But also I would say that we need to look at local solutions to local problems. And that brings me back to my belief that the solution set needs to be context specific and context sensitive. A conflict sensitivity approach to counter IED. They are existing in a lot of conflict resolution, and we need to bring them and start adapting them and embedding them within our counter IED enterprises. Back to you, Elise.
Yeah, so going back to the chat, there is a question on the use of microcontrollers in IEDs. So have you seen any use of them, indicating a technology transfer from the Ukrainian war?
To be honest, I don't have my finger on the pulse anymore in terms of the technical complexity of the actual switches being used. But from open source reading, I have come across that there seems to be microcontroller use within Africa in certain places. Specifically, I can't actually quote at present, but there's nothing to say that there's any inhibitor there from there not being in use. So I can't categorically quote instance where they have been known to be used, but there would be nothing to say that they aren't in use, owing to virtually no barrier there that used to be there in terms of the knowledge of what is needed, and then the supply chains to be able to get access to these through the globalized supply chains that are now ubiquitous throughout the globe. So not specifically, but I would highly say there's more than likely going to be those used some places within Africa.
Thank you, Paul. We have a set of 3 very interesting questions. To what extent are drones carrying an explosive payload genuinely considered to be IEDs? Is the criterion of victim activation taken into account? And do the different regional frameworks have integrated this question?
I caught your first 2 parts there, and I'll just ask you to repeat the third one in a moment. Sorry. So I think the first one is referring to when does the word improvise start get used with drones? And we do have the conventional military spec or even just security forces drone specification at the moment. We can get into quite elaborate and often very interesting conversations of at what point does a drone become an improvised drone and then therefore an IED. And at the moment, it's a shifting debate. For me, how I would talk about it is that unless it is factory produced, specified as a platform which has some type of explosive ordnance in its design, original design intent, it is improvised thereafter. Because if we have anyway modified something that is a commercial or industrial drone and put a payload on it, or we have anyway modified an existing piece of explosive ordnance that wasn't originally intended for use in a drone, it's improvised. Because once we start improvising, we're losing any quality assurance in terms of the dependability of how it may function. And that for me is, I've always looked at that divide between what is a conventional piece of explosive ordnance or what is an improvised piece of explosive ordnance. Sometimes it gets quite tenuous because you only might change a small part of a fusing design within an item of conventional explosive ordnance, and it gets quite tenuous. But for me, anything which is improvised and put on an aerial platform is an IED, and it's just the drone IED nexus we're talking about there. In terms of the victim operated, if I have your question correct, yes, we do see the integration of sometimes primary victim operated devices. And one of the tactics which emerged in Ukraine was the massive demand to exploit as much of the drone IEDs or conventional drones as possible to allow countermeasures to be developed. And there was a big effort then for personnel to rush forward in a lot of cases and try and capture them. At which point this was seen to be the TTP, and through TTP identification, they then started to integrate victim operated devices specifically to target those first responders. So victim operated devices can be the primary function, or we can have a case where the primary switch might be some type of impact fuse and a backup anti-handling device, again, sometimes referred to as a booby trap, is integrated to stop them being rendered safe and recovered for exploitation purposes. So absolutely, that is an issue. The victim operated switch has been integrated into drone IEDs. And Elise, back to you for your third question, if you wouldn't mind repeating that.
There was the criterion of victim activation taken into account, and the different regional frameworks integrating this question or not.
Is the different regional frameworks looking at drones? Is that the question?
Maybe.
Okay.
I'll take that. Clarify. Okay. Yes.
Okay. I'll take that. Yes. To the best of my knowledge, yes. Like the language being used in a lot of the UN documentation, it is being acknowledged, it is being pointed towards, and the appropriate diplomatic language is being integrated, where we look at I've continually used the concept of the IED drone nexus, or drone delivered IEDs. It certainly is being accounted for and looked at. Just to expand the point there, the way I would look at the drone IED nexus, it is absolutely significant in the capability is providing to non-state actors in terms of what was previously a two-dimensional terrestrial ground level threat is now a three-dimensional threat in the aerial domain as well, and it's been evolved down to the lowest level. And they use the term the democratization of the aerial domain to non-state actors. It's been that transformative. But bringing it back to the solutions which we might apply to this, when the vehicle-borne IED emerged predominantly in the 1970s in Northern Ireland, we didn't sort of stop and say this is a whole new problem. It's just a different means by which the IED was being deployed to its target. We've to sort of take that same systematic approach with drones, in my opinion. Now, like we had to develop new solutions for vehicle-borne IEDs, we need to develop new solutions for drone in placed IEDs as well. But we shouldn't think that this is a whole new problem. There's still IEDs or there's still items of explosive ordnance being deployed by an aerial means, and we just need to come up with those new countermeasures and solution sets as we get more knowledgeable of what works, what doesn't work, and what in what contexts they work. Just to circle back then to the question, yes, they are absolutely all the international debates at the regional level are accounting for and looking towards the drone IED nexus.
Thank you, Paul. I still have two questions in the chat for you. Do you consider that Boko Haram is just transformed into ISWAP, or do other remnants of Boko Haram still function? And the second one, what type of technical and equipment support are made available to mitigate the drone threats in Africa?
To the first question, it's beyond my area of expertise. I certainly have a keen interest in following how threat groups develop, morph, amalgamate, split. But there are people far more knowledgeable than myself within particularly the intelligence community who look at these matters. I have seen that, yes, certain papers over the years have said Boko Haram are no more and Boko Haram are now ISWAP, and then you see that Boko Haram are back. But it seems to be a shifting labeling almost. And I know that I'm not going to dismiss that sometimes labels matter because ideologies then go with certain labels, but it's not something I am confident to say I have a firm grasp on. There would be others more knowledgeable than myself. In terms of the solutions for available in Africa, at the moment, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of mature solutions as part of that toolbox we're going to have to develop for drones. And we're going to have to just keep working on that. And no more than when IEDs first appeared in Africa, maybe 10, 15 years ago, we were slow and we had a very poor, low starting base. We're at that same point when it comes to the drone response now at the moment. We must keep advocating that investment is needed in proper long-term solutions, not silver bullet solutions, and build up our toolbox. But at the moment, it's a fairly scant toolbox, and we need to advocate the degree of the threat, look at what's going to work, and then invest where there's going to be sustainable solutions, not just buying equipment and not getting the sustainment packages, the workshops, the expertise to sustain them. And as I say, that is the front end, defeat the device piece. We need to look at the back end of the longer preventative piece as well. So we are where we were 15 years ago when it comes to drones in terms of building this and going forward. What I would say is the African AU and other establishments should look at trying to maybe develop those solution sets within Africa. We have a feeling that we need to go to the other established military industrial complex companies. If it works and it can be done in Africa, let's start getting those solutions developed in Africa. And then you can actually create an industry that is sustainable within Africa. I would advocate for that. Back to you, Elise.
Thank you, Paul. So we have obviously a question from Pascaline. Awonimo. Hopefully I pronounce it correctly. So you have the floor. Pascaline, it seems that you're muted. I don't know why it's not working, but Pascaline, it seems that you're muted. Do we have in the meantime anyone else who would like to ask a question? No. Okay. We've discussed the added value of regionally coordinated approaches, as well as the emergence of regional strategies and policies. Building on this, I would like to invite Paul and the audience to reflect on how such cooperation might be taken a step further at the international level, and how these issues could be more effectively addressed within global policy discussions. So given that IEDs and other improvised threats do not easily align with a single international arms control framework, do you consider that there is a need for a dedicated global framework, or do existing instruments already provide a sufficiently comprehensive basis to address these challenges?
And Lisa, was that directed at me? Apologies.
Yeah, can be.
Okay.
Unless someone else would like to take the floor.
Apologies. Absolutely. Anyone else is welcome to. If not, Elisa, I'll just add a small point to that. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
A small point. I know that at the international UN level, there is talk about is a dedicated instrument to IEDs needed and warranted. It's not something that's been dismissed. It's also not something that's totally embraced as well. But the fact that it's such a destabilizing international security issue, it's inhibiting development and massively impacting humanitarian efforts. It is. There are open-minded debates and discussions. Or can we use existing vehicles such as amended Protocol 2 of the CCW and make that more engaged in trying to harmonize better responses? So that debate is happening. What I would say is probably something that's happening, and it was referred to in the brief there. We have a convergence of the threat systems. What was traditionally maybe siloed as IEDs and could be considered like suicide belts, roadside bombs, vehicle-borne IEDs. We now have this idea of improvisation of weapon systems themselves across a full spectrum. And that would be the traditional IED. We have the drone IED Nexus, which I've said is a manifestation of the drone, but it's in the aerial domain. We can't look beyond the maritime domain as well, where we have now the emergence of very functional, improvised waterborne IEDs. You can expand that onto privately manufactured firearms and the whole proliferation there coming into. They're not IEDs, but they are improvised. And then we have larger weapon systems which are established, such as mortar systems, very prevalent in the conflict in Northern Ireland, and various improvised rocket systems which were prevalent in the Syrian civil war, barrel bombs. So do we need to now have an international instrument that looks at improvised weapon systems rather than just IEDs? So that's something that's ongoing. I know that debate is great and it is necessary, but we probably need to get progress in trying to get some type of rallying call to get greater coherence internationally to deal with this, because traditionally, and a lot of evidence does show, it is civilians who are at the front end of suffering most from such systems. And it's not to say armed actors don't, but it is predominantly the civilian population who suffer most.
Thank you, Paul. Lina Maria Castillo, I see that you have raised your hand. Could you please take the floor?
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me there. Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you. I was struggling to find how to turn on the mic. So that's actually the question you raised is the question that I was going to make, and especially because there seems to be very little appetite to develop additional frameworks, and discussions are taking too long. And as Paul mentioned, we need to start taking measures now. And the longer we wait, then technologies keep developing, and the world and the the situation gets worse. So I think that we need to do something as soon as possible. Working in the Americas, one of the big questions we have is, should we work or try to develop more frameworks, or should we adapt what exists based on impacts rather than specific categories, or more using the IED definitions, and anything that is modified then gets in that. Let's say we can work with that, but using what exists already rather than developing more frameworks, because I think that there's also certain fatigue in countries to produce or to have to develop more monitoring frameworks, more other tools that are not maybe as useful as they think, and then that are actually not targeting the real issues that they're facing right now. And as these technologies keep evolving, and we have drones, but we also have autonomous and semi-autonomous systems that can also be improvised. That is all adding up, and I think that catching the wave is going to be very hard. So these are just reflections and and questions that we've been raising here in the Americas.
Thank you very much. Yeah, really interesting and pertinent points. The kernel of what you're talking about there is the fact that the pace of threat evolution is outmatching our international ability to respond to it. As soon as we try and laser in and get a focus on what the threat is, it's moved on and escalated. It's become bigger, and we're slow and lethargic in our responses. And it feeds back to, these are asymmetric threat weapon systems, and that is the power of asymmetric threat weapon systems. So we have to not accept defeat, but we have to accept that that's the battle we're up against. I would say that when we try to think of new innovative ways rather than what might be traditional ways of going about this, and let's say a new instrument, and as you say, leverage what's there. What are the touch points? Can we expand them? How do we, get them to actually do more with what we have, rather than going through the laborious process, and that will take a lot of time to get international consensus for new instruments. So maybe work with what we have, and can we adapt? Easier said than done, but top of my head, open-ended working groups, where we're just looking at that, and we're laser focused on what the threat is. We need to minimize the administrative burden on countries, because some of the most affected countries have the least bandwidth for this. So we need to build them for them, where they will have impact and not just more bureaucratic process. So I take all your points on board. That's absolutely where we're at, and it's why we are falling short of where we may be internationally in our response. And those in internal dynamics are part of the reasons why our responses aren't as effective as they could possibly be.
Thank you, Paul, and many thanks to the participants who've raised engaging questions. The clock is ticking, so I will now give the floor back to Mr. Udobia for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Alize, and thank you, Paul, for a very brilliant and insightful discussion. So today's exchange has helped us to move beyond a purely national understanding of IED threats. As highlighted throughout the briefing, the issue is not only about individual incidents or country-specific responses, but about recognizing the broader regional dynamics that shape the use and spread of these devices. The objective of this session, as set out at the onset, was to stimulate strategic reflection and facilitate open dialogue on the importance of regional approaches. Today's discussion underscored the IED threats that are increasingly embedded within regional ecosystems characterized by cross-border supply chains, transnational armed group activity, permissive environment shaped by illicit economies, and the circulation of knowledge, materials, and tactics across borders. In the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, and Africa, we have heard how these dynamics combine to create complex, interconnected threats environment that cannot be effectively addressed through national responses alone. The examples shared today, particularly in Africa, also point to the growing importance of regional and continental initiatives, including those emerging through IGAD, ECOWAS, and the African Union. These efforts reflect an evolving recognition that effective responses require coordination across borders, greater information sharing and harmonization, and sustained engagement between security, civilian, and development actors. The notion of approaching IED threats through a regional lens, one that considers systems, flows, and interdependence rather than isolated contexts, provides more food for thought. Such complexity reinforces the importance of sustained and informed dialogue at the multilateral level. Today's exchange has once again demonstrated the value of structured, evidence-based discussion that bring together different regional perspectives. Before policy response evolve further, it remains essential that we share assessments, compare regional experiences, and continue to explore how emerging practices can inform global frameworks. Informal and analytical spaces such as this contribute meaningfully to strengthening our collective understanding and to shaping more effective responses. As we look ahead to upcoming multilateral processes, including the Secretary General's report, the General Assembly resolution, and the CCW review conference, continued engagement in a constructive and inclusive spirit will be essential. If today's discussion has shown anything, it is that addressing IED threats requires not only national efforts, but sustained regional cooperation and shared understanding. At this point, I'll say thank you so much for everyone. Thank you, Alizi. I'll hand over the floor to you again.
Thank you, Frederick. Right on time. So before we officially close the briefing, please note that we will organize a third session on people-centered human security responses to IED threats, as mentioned by Paul, that will be chaired by Australia on the 10th of June. So stay tuned and don't hesitate in the meantime to contact us should you have any questions or requests. Thank you, everyone, and I wish you a pleasant afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Bye.